In this video, we'll look at how satisfied the big three were with the Treaty of Versailles. Just two things to note before we do. First, this is a popular exam question because it tests whether you understand the aims of the big three at the Paris Peace Conference, and it tests how well you understand the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. You'll then need to apply that knowledge to the questions about how satisfied the big three were. Second, this topic is important because the Treaty of Versailles was a compromise. None of the leaders got everything they wanted. Clemenceau, Wilson, and Lloyd George all liked some parts of the treaty, but they were also disappointed by other parts. So let's look at each leader in turn. First, we'll look at George Clemenceau, the leader of France. As a reminder, Clemenceau had suffered the most direct damage from Germany during the First World War. Large parts of northern France had been destroyed. Because of this, Clemenceau wanted Germany to be as weakened as much as possible. There were several parts of the treaty that Clemenceau liked. First, he liked Clause 231, also known as the War Guilt Clause. This forced Germany to accept responsibility for war. For Clemenceau, this was important because it justified punishing Germany. Second, Clemenceau liked disarmament. The German army was reduced to 100,000 soldiers, Germany was not allowed tanks, submarines, or an air force, and the navy was limited to 6 battleships. This helped reduce the threat Germany posed to France. Third, Clemenceau liked reparations. Germany had to pay compensation for the damage caused by the war. This was especially important to France because much of the fighting on the Western Front had taken place on French land. Fourth, Clemenceau was pleased that Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine from France in 1871, so getting it back was a major French aim. However, Clemenceau was not fully satisfied. He was disappointed that France only gained control of the Saar for 15 years. Clemenceau wanted France to benefit from the Saar's coalfields for longer because Saar was valuable for rebuilding after the war. More importantly, Clemenceau wanted an independent Rhineland. He wanted the Rhineland separated from Germany completely so it could act as a buffer zone between France and Germany. Instead, the Rhineland was only demilitarised. This meant that Germany could keep the Rhineland, but German troops were not allowed there. Finally, Clemenceau wanted reparations set at a higher figure to contribute towards the rebuilding of France. So, Clemenceau was partly satisfied. He liked the harsh punishments against Germany, but he still thought the treaty was not harsh enough. Next, let's look at Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States of America. Wilson had a very different view from Clemenceau. He wanted a fair peace based upon his 14 points. His aim was not simply to punish Germany, but to create a more peaceful world after the war ended. There were some parts of the treaty that Wilson liked. Most importantly, Wilson was pleased that the League of Nations was created. This was one of his biggest ideas. The League of Nations was meant to be an international organisation where countries could discuss problems instead of going to war. Wilson also liked the idea of self-determination being used in parts of Europe. Self-determination meant that national groups should be given the right to govern themselves. This helped lead to the creation or recognition of countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. However, Wilson was also deeply disappointed. Many of these 14 points were ignored. For example, Wilson wanted freedom of the seas, but Britain opposed this because Britain wanted to protect the strength of its navy and of its empire. Wilson also disliked the fact that only the defeated powers were made to disarm. He had hoped for a much wider disarmament, not just restrictions placed upon Germany. He was also happy about the treatment of colonies. Colonies were not simply given independence, instead many former German colonies were turned into mandates controlled by Britain or France. The people living in those colonies were given very little say in their future. The biggest disappointment for Wilson came after the treaty was signed. The American Senate refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles and refused to join the League of Nations. This was a huge blow to Wilson. The League of Nations had been his main idea, but his own country did not join it. So, Wilson was only partly satisfied. He liked the creation of the League of Nations and some use of self-determination, but he was disappointed that many of his wider ideas were ignored. Finally, let's look at David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Lloyd George was in a difficult position. Many people in Britain wanted Germany to be punished, and during the 1918 election there had been pressure to make Germany pay. However, Lloyd George was also worried that if Germany was treated too harshly, it could damage trade, create instability and possibly lead to another war. There were parts of the treaty that David Lloyd George liked. First, he was pleased that the German navy was reduced. Britain had the strongest navy in the world, and Germany's naval power had been a major threat before 1914. Reducing the German navy helped protect British naval power. Lloyd George was also satisfied that Britain gained some former German colonies as British mandates. This helped expand British influence after the war. However, Lloyd George also disliked some parts of the treaty. He disagreed with Wilson's ideas about colonies and freedom of the seas. Britain did not want to weaken its empire or reduce its control over the seas. At the same time, Lloyd George was worried about Clemenceau's harshness. He thought that punishing Germany too severely could create resentment and make future conflicts more likely. For example, reparations meant that Germany had to pay compensation for the damage caused by the war. Lloyd George was worried the payments were too high and that Germany's economy would be weakened too much. This mattered to Britain because Germany had been an important trading partner before the war. If Germany's economy collapsed, it would be harder for Britain to trade with Germany in the future. Militarily, Lloyd George did not want Germany to become too weak. He believed Europe needed a stable Germany to help prevent the spread of communism and maintain the balance of power in Europe. So, Lloyd George was only partly satisfied. He liked reducing Germany's navy and gaining mandates, but he was concerned the treaty may have been too harsh and unstable. So, how satisfied were the big three with the Treaty of Versailles? The best answer is that all three leaders were only partly satisfied. Clemenceau thought the treaty punished Germany, but not enough. He wanted an independent Rhineland, not just a demilitarised one. Wilson liked the League of Nations and self-determination, but many of his 14 points were ignored, and the USA refused to join the League. Lloyd George liked weakening Germany's navy and gaining mandates, but he worried that the treaty was too harsh and might create future problems. All of this shows that the Treaty of Versailles was a compromised peace. It was not exactly what France wanted, not exactly what America wanted, and not exactly what Britain wanted. This is why historians often argue that the treaty left many people dissatisfied. Germany hated it, but even the victorious powers had serious concerns about it.